Tonight, we revisit one case that began in a Lancashire village within reach of Liverpool and ended on a scaffold on the far side of the world. One family laid beneath one floor, one bride carried across an ocean to a second floor built to the same purpose. One man, one recurring method, and one conviction that entered the national record and has remained there. The case of Frederick Bailey Deeming begins in Rainhill, in Lancashire, in the summer of 1891. Rainhill in that decade was not a town so much as a village grown accustomed to being passed through. It sat in the southwest of the county, a little under 10 miles east of Liverpool and a comparable distance west of the manufacturing town of St Helens, on ground that had once been open farmland and had since been threaded by one of the most consequential lengths of iron in the industrial world. It was at Rainhill, some 60 years before the events described here, that the trials had been held to determine which locomotive would run the Liverpool and Manchester line, and the village had kept, ever since, the character of a place the railway had chosen to notice. The station stood on the main line. Trains that mattered stopped there. A man could take his breakfast in Rainhill and his supper in Liverpool without any sense that he had travelled far, and it is this ordinary, unremarkable accessibility, the fact that Rainhill was a place one could arrive at quietly and leave from just as quietly, that the record will return to before this account is finished. The village itself was modest and respectable in the manner of the period. There was the parish, there were the shops that a settlement of its size required, there was a public house and a hotel, the commercial hotel, where a stranger of decent appearance and ready money might take a room without exciting comment or question. The population was the population of a Lancashire village of the late Victorian decades, railwaymen and their families, tradesmen, servants, the small professional and shopkeeping class that gave such places their steadiness, and above them the households of the more comfortable sort who took the larger houses set back from the road. The streets were clean and the buildings were sound. It was not a slum, and it was not a place associated in the public mind with anything darker than the ordinary business of getting a living. Newspapers, when they wished to convey the particular weight of what had happened, would lean precisely on this, that it had happened in Rainhill, of all places, a village whose name had until then meant only the railway trials and the quiet passage of the line. Among the houses available to a man of means in that summer was a detached villa that the record has fixed under the name Dinham Villa. It was a house of the comfortable class, set apart, with a kitchen whose floor would shortly become the most examined few square yards of ground in the county. A man arrived in Rainhill in the 3rd week of July 1891, presented himself at the commercial hotel, made inquiries about the villa, and gave every appearance of a gentleman of standing preparing a household. He signed an agreement of tenancy. He was, the surviving accounts agree, particular about the terms. Particular in a way that would only later acquire meaning, that the house should not be re-let for a stated period on account of relatives said to be arriving. Barrels of a common building material were ordered and delivered to the villa in the days that followed. The record establishes this much without difficulty. What it does not yet know, in the 3rd week of that July, is that the floor of the kitchen at Dinham Villa is the object on which this entire account will come to rest. The first victims in this case are a woman and 4 children, and it is proper that they be introduced before the man who ended their lives, because the record has too often reversed that order. The woman was born Marie James. She came from the district around Birkenhead and the Cheshire bank of the Mersey, and she was, by the account of those who knew both families, a childhood connection of the man she would marry. The two families, James and Deeming, being bound together closely enough that a brother of Frederick Deeming, named Albert, married a sister of Marie, named Martha. The precise particulars of Marie's early life are not established in any primary source recovered for this account beyond these outlines: that she was of the Birkenhead district, that the James and Deeming families were long acquainted, and that her connection to Frederick Deeming predated their marriage by years. The record offers little of her as a person distinct from her marriage, and that scarcity is itself part of what this case has left behind. She married Frederick Bailey Deeming on the 28th of February 1881 at Tranmere in Cheshire, a date the Australian biographical record fixes with some confidence, though older secondary accounts have occasionally placed the marriage a year earlier, and the discrepancy requires verification against the parish register rather than the retellings. Within months of the marriage, her husband had left England for the Australian colonies, and the shape of Marie's life, for the decade that followed, was set by that pattern: a husband who went ahead, who summoned, who moved, who prospered and failed and moved again, and a wife who followed with the children across the world and back. She joined him in Sydney in the second half of 1881. Of the 4 children the marriage produced, the surviving record indicates that 2 of the daughters were born in Australia. The names Bertha and Marie appear in the accounts, and that the family's wanderings took them through Sydney, through Melbourne, through Rockhampton in Queensland, and back to Sydney again, before circumstances and her husband's affairs carried them once more to England. It is a feature of this case, and a painful one, that the 4 children cannot all be named with the same confidence. The record is consistent that there were 4. It is consistent that they were young, none older than about 8 or 9. It is consistent that the youngest was an infant born after the family's return to England, at Birkenhead. The name Liala is attached in some accounts to that youngest child. Beyond this, the individual identities of the 4 blur in the surviving material into a single category: the children, the family, Deeming's children, and the reader should mark that blurring now, because it is the first appearance of a pattern this account will name again at its close: the reduction of the victims to an occasion. What can be said with certainty is how Marie and the children are known to history at all. They are known through the identification of their remains, through the testimony given at the inquest that followed, through the evidence of Frederick Deeming's own brothers, who came forward to say that the woman and children recovered at Rainhill were their kinswoman and her family. Any description of Marie as a living person, her appearance, her manner, her voice, comes to us not from any independent portrait, but through these same channels, the channels of testimony and inquest, and must be understood as representation rather than as independent assessment. The record establishes that she existed, that she married, that she followed her husband across the world, that she bore him 4 children, and that in the summer of 1891 she was in England, at Birkenhead, with those children believing, so far as anything of her belief can be reconstructed from the surviving material, which is very little, that her husband was preparing a home for them. In the 3rd week of July 1891, that belief brought her and the 4 children to Rainhill. The surviving reconstruction of events has Marie taking tea with her husband at the commercial hotel on one day, and the children arriving at Dinham Villa a day or 2 afterward, so that by the 25th of July, the woman and the 4 children were together at the villa on the edge of that quiet railway village. This is the point at which the account must set them down. The record establishes their arrival. It does not, for the moment, go further. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Now, back to the record. Frederick Bailey Deeming was born on the 30th of July 1853 at Ashby de la Zouch in Leicestershire, the son of Thomas Deeming, a brazier, a worker in brass and metal, and his wife Anne, whose maiden name was Bailey. Little of his childhood is documented in surviving records beyond the fact of his birth and parentage and the assertions he himself made in later life, which are of uncertain value. He claimed to have spent years in asylums and to have been epileptic from the age of 18, and he claimed the same institutional history for both his parents. His surviving brother Albert would later deny those claims outright. The record therefore holds two accounts of the man's origins that do not agree, and in the space between them, a good deal of what was later argued about him would be fought. What is not in dispute is the shape of the life that followed. He ran off to sea at about the age of 16, and from that point his history is a long sequence of movement and false representation, a career, as the older biographical accounts put it, without ornament, largely of thieving and of obtaining money under false pretenses. He worked as a plumber and a gas fitter, a trade that gave him a respectable-seeming occupation and a reason to present himself in new places, and he practiced it across 2 hemispheres. He was in Sydney by 1881, having deserted the ship on which he had travelled. In April 1882, he was sentenced to 6 weeks' imprisonment there for the larceny of gas burners, a small and characteristic offence. He moved through Melbourne, through Rockhampton, back to Sydney, where for a short while he prospered in business on his own account, before a bankruptcy in the late 1880s and a further short term of imprisonment. He travelled to South Africa. He returned to England. And wherever he went, he carried names that were not his own. This is the detail the record insists upon, because it is the mechanism of the entire case. Deeming did not operate under one false identity, but under many, layered and discarded as circumstances required. In the events of this account alone, he appears as Albert Williams, as Druin or Droon, as Dawson, as Duncan, as Baron Swanston. He assumed occupations to match: army inspector, mining engineer, gentleman of means, and he assumed the manner to carry them. Contemporary descriptions of him vary, and some are plainly the product of the vilification that later attached to his name. A number of newspapers described him as ape-like, and years afterward a medical man spoke of his skull as resembling that of a gorilla. But these are characterizations produced after his conviction and colored by it, and the surviving photographs do not obviously support them. Set against them is the plainer and more troubling fact, recorded by those who dealt with him before they knew what he was, that he was widely found charming, personable, respectable in his bearing, attentive, a man to whom householders let their properties without hesitation because of his air of standing. Both things are in the record. The account does not need to resolve them. It needs only to note that a man who was found agreeable by those who met him is the man at the centre of this case. His domestic situation in the summer of 1891 was, on its surface, that of a married man with a wife and 4 children lately returned to England. Its actual character was something the law would later find harder to name. He had already, in February 1890, gone through a bigamous marriage with a woman he afterward deserted, the Miss Matheson of the older accounts, while his lawful wife and children were living. Bigamy, in his case, was not an aberration, but a habit. The marriage certificate was simply another false document, entered under a false name, in the same manner as the leases and the testimonials. The friction that developed in the summer of 1891 is, as motive must always be treated where confession is absent, a matter of inference from the evidence rather than of stated fact. What the evidence shows is that in July of that year, Frederick Deeming had a wife and 4 children in England, and that at the same time he was making himself agreeable in Rainhill to a young woman of that place, Emily Lydia Mather, the daughter of a widowed local shopkeeper, Mrs. Dove Mather. The record establishes the presence of both women in his life in that single summer. It establishes that a household stood between the man and the second marriage he intended. It does not require the account to say more than that, because what he did next says it. The final known movements of Marie Deeming and her 4 children can be reconstructed only to a point, and then the record goes silent in the particular way that this case makes its own. They were at Dinham Villa by the 25th of July, 1891. The house had been taken, the building material had been ordered, the tenancy had been drawn so that the property would not be re-let for a period, on the stated ground that relatives were expected. And then the woman and the 4 children, who had followed this man across the world and back, were not seen alive again. What happened within the villa is described in the flattest terms the evidence permits, and the account will not exceed them. The medical evidence and the inquest that followed established that the woman and the eldest of the children, a girl of about 9, died by strangulation, and that the throats of the others were cut. The sequence, as it was later reconstructed through the proceedings, suggested that the eldest child may have woken while the rest of the work was being done, and been killed to keep her silent. This reconstruction rests on the coroner's reasoning at the inquest rather than on any witnessed account, and it is offered here as the inference it was, not as established fact. The number of the dead was 5, the woman and 4 children. The method is described in the primary materials as the account has just given it. There is no need to say it a second way. What followed the deaths is documented with more precision because it left physical traces and required the labor of other hands. The bodies were placed beneath the floor of the villa's kitchen and covered over with cement. The barrels of building material ordered in the days before now accounted for. The floor was made good. And the man who had done this then behaved, in the weeks that followed, exactly as a man would who intended the concealment to hold. He complained that the drains of the house were defective and that the kitchen floor required replacing, and he supervised the work upon it closely. He accounted for the absence of his wife and children with a cover story, telling those who might have asked that the woman was his sister, that she had been staying with him and that she had gone to rejoin her husband abroad, at Port Said, in one version he gave. To his own brothers and to Marie's sister Martha, he conveyed the impression that the family had gone away on holiday and then abroad, and he made visits calculated to reassure. The concealment was not a single act, but a maintained performance, sustained over weeks, and it held. It held long enough for him to complete what the killings had been in service of. On the 22nd of September, 1891, at St. Anne's Church in Rainhill, under the name Albert Williams and in the character of an army inspector, the son, he claimed, of a colonel, Frederick Deeming, married Emily Lydia Mather. The wedding was followed by a lavish banquet, given in the village where his first family lay, under the kitchen floor of a house a short distance off. The couple then left England. Under the name Williams, he took his new wife aboard the German steamship Kaiser Wilhelm II, and they arrived at Melbourne, in the colony of Victoria, on the 15th of December, 1891. There, the pattern recurred, in a manner so exact that the recurrence would itself become part of the case against him. He rented a brick cottage. The record fixes it at 57 Andrew Street, in the Melbourne suburb of Windsor, under yet another name, paying a month's rent in advance to the owner, a nearby butcher named John Stamford, who let the house readily on account of his tenant's respectable air, and who at first did not even know the man's name with certainty. Deeming explained a need for building material by complaining, as he had complained at Rainhill, of a defect in the fabric of the house. The walls, he said, were full of nail holes he intended to fill. On or about Christmas Day of 1891, in that cottage he killed Emily Mather. The medical evidence established that her skull had been fractured in several places and her throat cut, the latter judged at the post-mortem to be the more likely immediate cause of death. He buried her beneath the hearthstone of one of the bedrooms and covered the body with cement bought a week earlier. He made the floor good, and, as at Rainhill, he left very soon afterward, and for a time the concealment held there too. For a few weeks in the new year of 1892, He moved through the colonies as he had always moved, auctioning the dead woman's clothes and his own effects under one name, defrauding a jeweler, writing to a matrimonial agency under another name in search of a further wife, sailing to Sydney, and there becoming engaged to a young woman named Kate Rouncefell, before travelling on to Western Australia as Baron Swanston to seek work as a mining engineer. He had murdered a household in England and a wife in Australia within the span of 6 months, concealed both beneath cemented floors by the same method, and by early 1892 he was arranging a third marriage. The record establishes each of these facts separately and in sequence. Set end to end, they are the case. The crime came to light, as concealed crimes so often do, not through detection in the first instance, but through the ordinary working of a house that its owner wished to let again. On the 3rd of March 1892, a prospective tenant, viewing the vacant cottage at 57 Andrew Street, complained of a disagreeable smell in the second bedroom. The owner and the estate agent went to investigate, and when the hearthstone was raised, the source of the smell was such that, by the account entered afterward, those present could scarcely remain in the room. The police were called. Beneath the hearthstone, set into cement, they found the body of a young woman. A post-mortem examination followed on the 4th of March. Publicity followed almost at once, and it followed on a scale that would shape everything that came after. Within days, a Melbourne newspaper had already drawn a line, however speculatively, between the manner of this killing and the unsolved Whitechapel murders in London of a few years before, and the suggestion, once made, would not be unmade. The investigation proper was the work of the Victoria Police, and in particular of 2 officers whom the record names, the detectives Considine and Corsi. Their task at the outset was defined by absence. They had a body and an empty house, and a tenant who had gone. What they had, besides, was the residue that even a careful man leaves behind him, the testimony of the tradespeople who had dealt with the man calling himself by his several names: Stamford the butcher and his agent, a local laundress, an ironmonger who had sold him cement, the carriers who had moved his goods. From these accounts the detectives assembled a description and a set of movements, and the movements led to a ship. They established that the man answering the description had arrived at Melbourne aboard the Kaiser Wilhelm II, and by interviewing others who had sailed on that vessel, they gathered corroborating descriptions of the man and of the young woman who had travelled with him as his wife. A young woman who, in the weeks at sea, had spoken to fellow passengers of her family at home at Rainhill. It was a single object that carried the case across the world. Among the material connected with the man was a crumpled invitation to a dinner, the lavish banquet given at the commercial hotel in Rainhill under the name Albert Williams. That scrap, and the name upon it, gave the Australian detectives a place and a person to inquire after, and they telegraphed the Lancashire police asking them to investigate the dinner and to find, if they could, this Mr. Williams, who might account for the missing woman and family. The Lancashire inquiries led to a Rainhill news agency, and the news agency was kept by a Mrs. Mather, the mother of the very young woman whose body lay under the hearthstone in Windsor. The lines converged there, 10,000 miles apart, at a shop counter in a Lancashire village. It should be recorded, because it bears on how the case was afterward remembered, that the press played a part in this convergence. An English journalist working for a Melbourne paper reached Mrs. Mather at Rainhill before the official notification did, and it was he, by the surviving accounts, who first told her that her daughter had been murdered. With the Rainhill connection made, attention turned to the house Williams had occupied in the village the previous summer. On or about the 16th of March 1892, the kitchen floor of Dinham Villa was taken up. Beneath it, set in cement, as the woman in Windsor had been set beneath her hearthstone, were the bodies of Marie Deeming and the 4 children. 2 days later, on the 18th of March, an inquest was held at Rainhill. Frederick Deeming's brothers came forward. The record notes the particular detail that his brother Albert and Albert's wife Martha, Marie's own sister, were among those who identified the dead, and that Albert did so with evident distress. 17 witnesses were called. The inquest found that Marie Deeming and her 4 children had been willfully murdered, and it named the man responsible. By then, that man was already in custody on the other side of the world. Following the Melbourne discovery, telegrams had gone from the Victoria Police to Western Australia, and on the 11th or 12th of March 1892, the sources differ by a day, he was arrested at Southern Cross, a mining township in the west, where he had obtained a position by means of forged testimonials, and was living under the name Baron Swanston. He began by denying that he was Deeming. He then said, in words the record preserves, that he believed he knew the party who had been murdered, and that he did not believe anyone would have had the heart to murder a girl of that kind. Found in his possession were belongings of the murdered Emily Mather, among them her prayer book. He was taken back across the continent toward Melbourne to stand trial, and the journey itself became a public event. At more than one point, the train carrying him was met by crowds calling for his death, and at one station the carriage was rocked and a window broken. The colony had already decided what it thought of him before any court had sat. The medical evidence in this case rests on 2 examinations, conducted on opposite sides of the world within a fortnight of each other, and on the particular difficulty that both bodies of the dead had been recovered from cement. The Windsor post-mortem was conducted on the 4th of March 1892, the day after Emily Mather's body was found. The condition of the remains was that of a body some 10 weeks buried beneath a cemented hearthstone, and the examination had to be read against that decomposition. What the medical evidence established was that the skull had been fractured in several places and that the throat had been cut, and that of these injuries the wound to the throat was judged the more probable immediate cause of death. Identification, in the circumstances, could not rest on appearance alone. It rested on the convergence of other evidence, the association of the body with the man who had rented the house, the belongings, the accounts of the tradespeople and the ship's passengers, and above all, the connection made through the dinner invitation and the Lancashire inquiries to the Mather family of Rainhill. Where identification of remains proceeds by convergence rather than by certainty, the account must say so, and it says so here. The body beneath the hearthstone was established to be Emily Lydia Mather by the weight of surrounding evidence rather than by any single, unchallengeable physical proof. The Rainhill remains presented the same difficulty in graver form, for there were 5 bodies rather than 1, and they had lain beneath the villa floor since the previous July. The medical and inquest evidence established the causes of death already stated: strangulation in the case of the woman and the eldest child, incised wounds to the throat in the others. Here the identification was assisted by 2 things: the record names. The first was the testimony of the brothers, who knew the woman and the children and identified them. The second was an object recovered with the bodies, a book in which the name Deeming had been struck out and the name Williams written in its place. That single alteration, a name crossed out and a false name substituted, tied the man who had lived as Williams at Dinham Villa to the man born Deeming, and did so in his own domestic effects, among his own dead. It was a small piece of paper, doing the work that no examination of the remains alone could have done. There is a further forensic detail that belongs to the record, because it bears on why these bodies could be examined at all. The concealment relied on cement, and, in the practice of such concealments and such burials, on the expectation that lime and decomposition would in time leave little to be found. In this, the expectation was, by the assessment of those who considered it afterward, partly defeated. the very materials meant to hasten the destruction of the remains appear in some measure to have preserved them, holding the bodies in a condition that still permitted the medical findings to be made and entered in the official record. What physical evidence the condition of the remains denied, the finer marks that a fresher body would have yielded, is not recoverable now and was not wholly recoverable then, and the account notes that absence rather than filling it. The findings that could be made were entered into the formal record of 2 inquests on 2 continents, and stood. Deeming was tried not in England, but in the colony of Victoria, and the reason is itself part of the record. Both jurisdictions had a claim on him: Rainhill for the murder of his wife and children, Windsor for the murder of Emily Mather, and Australia, having his body and a completed investigation, proceeded first. Had the Melbourne trial failed to secure a conviction, arrangements were already in hand to return him to England to answer for the Rainhill murders. It did not fail. The trial was held at the Supreme Court of Victoria, in Melbourne. It was presided over by Mr. Justice Henry Edward Agincourt Hodges, a judge of the colony's Supreme Court who had himself been born in Liverpool, England, and brought to Australia as a boy, so that the man who would sentence Deeming had entered the world within a short journey of the village where Deeming's first family lay. The prosecution was conducted by Robert Walsh, Queen's Counsel. The defence was led by Alfred Deakin, an advocate who would afterwards serve 3 times as Prime Minister of Australia, together with William Forlonge. The proceedings took place across 4 days, the 28th, 29th and 30th of April, and the 2nd of May 1892. Deeming was tried throughout under the name Williams, the name under which he had married and murdered Emily Mather. The atmosphere in which the trial was held cannot be separated from the verdict, and honesty requires that it be set down plainly. By the time the court sat, Deeming had become, in the phrase later applied to it, the most written about person in the country, and the coverage had passed beyond reporting into something the record describes as a campaign of vilification. He had been named in print, without proof, as the Whitechapel murderer of London. He had been called a mass murderer of South Africa. He had been called, in the more lurid columns, a vampire, on the strength of the reported absence of blood at his scenes. His supposed crimes had been staged in a Melbourne theatre before he came to trial. So general was the public frenzy that it acquired its own name in the newspapers of the day: D-mania. The defence, recognizing what this meant for the possibility of an impartial jury, sought an adjournment of a month, both to secure evidence of Deeming's psychiatric history and to allow the hysteria to subside. The judge granted 1 week. His right to be tried before a jury untouched by all this had, in the assessment of later commentators, already been destroyed before the first witness was called. The evidence was presented in the order the case demanded. First came the discovery at Windsor and the condition of the body beneath the hearthstone. Then came the domestic history, the arrival on the Kaiser Wilhelm II, the rented cottage, the false names, the cement, and, standing behind all of it now, the parallel discovery at Rainhill of a wife and 4 children concealed by the identical method, which the prosecution was able to use to show design where the defence wished the jury to see madness. Then came the medical testimony as to the cause of Emily Mather's death, and then came the conduct of the defendant himself, before and after. The defence was insanity. It was the only defence available to a man whose acts were, on the evidence, undeniable, and Deakin's task was to persuade the jury that the man who had done these things could not be held responsible for them. The psychiatric evidence was given by doctors of the colony. The names Springthorpe and Fishbourne are in the record, and it was, by the assessment entered afterward, inadequately presented, though it seems to have been accepted even by those who examined him that Deeming was in some degree epileptic. As many as 6 doctors examined him. Not one could state without qualification that he was insane in the sense the law required. Deeming did not assist his own defense. Perhaps in the hope of supporting the plea, he claimed to have contracted disease in London and to have received the visitations of his dead mother's spirit, urging him to his acts, and before the jury retired, he delivered a long and rambling address in his own justification, in which he repeated a story he had told the police, that Emily had run off with another man, and offered as his comfort the claim that she was therefore not dead. The jury did not believe him. It did not take them long. The defense of insanity failed because the evidence for it did not reach the standard the law set, and because the man in the dock had shown the court, across 4 days, a mind capable of design, concealment, and calculation over months and across oceans. The verdict was returned in the formal language of the court. Frederick Bailey Deeming, tried as Albert Williams, was found guilty of the willful murder of Emily Lydia Mather. The sentence was the sentence the law then prescribed for that crime: death by hanging. The judge, before whom the whole of it had been laid, addressed the condemned man before passing that sentence, as the practice of the court required. Deeming's case did not end in the courtroom. His counsel pursued the matter further. The sentence was confirmed by the colony's Executive Council on the 9th of May 1892, and an application for leave to appeal was carried all the way to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in London, which refused it on the 19th of May. With that refusal, the legal proceedings against him were, in every jurisdiction that could touch him, at an end. Frederick Bailey Deeming was executed on the 23rd of May 1892 at the Melbourne jail, 4 days after the Privy Council refused his appeal and a fortnight after the Executive Council confirmed his sentence. The execution was carried out within the walls of the jail, in the manner then required in the colony of Victoria, where hangings were no longer conducted in public view but within the prison, before a limited body of official witnesses. The officer who carried out the sentence is not named with certainty in the sources recovered for this account, and it is left as the record leaves it. Among those present and afterward reported upon was the jail's medical officer, Dr. Shields, whose office it was to certify that the sentence had been carried out and the man was dead. The record fixes the hour at 10:01 in the morning, and it fixes a smaller and more particular fact of the kind this case seems always to preserve, that the condemned man weighed, at the last, some 14 pounds less than when he had entered the prison. Beyond the walls, the demeanour of the colony was not in doubt. A crowd the accounts number at 12,000 had gathered in the streets outside the gaol, and when the death was declared, the crowd, by every surviving report, cheered it. Of the condemned man's own bearing at the end, there are reports, as there always are, drawn from prison officials and from the press, and the account enters them with the caution such reports require, because accounts of a hanged man's last conduct are not always reliable in their particulars, and are frequently shaped to the appetite of those who will read them. What can be said is that in his final days he wrote an autobiography, and verses, the surviving fragment of one of which turns his own trial and sentence into a grim rhyme, and that he spoke with ministers of the Church of England, to whom he is said to have made a confession. The matter of that confession is one on which the record must be careful. It was reported from Western Australia, before the trial, that Deeming had confessed to his solicitor to the Rainhill murders and to 2 of the Whitechapel killings, while disclaiming the others. It was reported that he confessed to the clergyman who attended him at the last. What these confessions confirmed, and how far any of them can be relied upon, is not established with certainty by the primary materials, and the most consequential of them, the claim of the Whitechapel murders, was one that the evidence of his own movements would not support, as the account will note in its close. The autobiography he wrote in the jail, which might have settled some of this, was destroyed, and the record is the poorer for it. He was buried within the grounds of the Melbourne gaol, in the manner of the executed, his remains covered with quicklime, in the expectation that they would in time be gone. With his burial, the legal proceedings that had begun with a complaint of a bad smell in a Windsor bedroom were formally and finally concluded. The case entered the record almost before the man was dead, and it entered it loudly. Within 1892 itself, a run of cheap printed accounts of Deeming's life and crimes appeared, 6 of them, several in more than one edition, together with a published lecture and a stage play of which now only the playbill survives. And he was fixed in the popular literature of the period under the title he has carried since, The Criminal of the Century. The academic treatment of the case in later decades has tended to take exactly this as its subject, not the killings alone, but the publishing frenzy around them, the manner in which a murder in a suburban cottage became, through the newspapers and the pamphlets and the waxworks, a national event and then a national myth. The books have continued to come, among them O'Sullivan's study of the trial, and later works by Gurvitch and Ray, and by Linnell, and the case remains one of the most written about in the country that hanged him. Much of that writing has been drawn to a question the evidence does not answer. Because Deeming had been in England in the years of the Whitechapel murders of 1888, and because the concealed, mutilated manner of his killings invited the comparison, the suggestion that he was Jack the Ripper attached itself to his name during his own lifetime, and has never fully left it. It should be stated plainly where the record stands. The Metropolitan Police of the time dismissed him as a suspect, on the ground that he was either imprisoned or in South Africa when the Whitechapel murders were committed. The comparison has been revived many times since, by documentary makers and by researchers, and it continues to be argued. But the contemporary official position was dismissal, and the disparity between his known movements and the dates of the London killings has never been resolved in favour of the theory. It is offered here as what it is, a persistent speculation attached to a proven murderer, and not as part of the case that was proved against him. Some physical record of the man survived his burial, and its history is a strange coda. His death mask was taken, as was then the custom with the executed. Casts of his head and of his right hand were made, and these, with photographs and papers relating to the case, are held to this day, the death mask on display at the old Melbourne gaol, where he was hanged, and further material in the State Library of Victoria. His actual remains fared less certainly. When the closed gaol's burial ground was disturbed for building work in 1929, and again when remains were relocated in the years that followed, the graves of its most notorious dead, Deeming's among them, were disturbed, confused, and in large part lost, so that the precise resting place of the criminal of the century can no longer be stated with confidence. The quicklime that was meant to erase him did its work unevenly. The paper record outlasted the body, and here the account must say the thing it has been holding back. This case is remembered as Deeming's case. It is titled with his name, catalogued under his name, argued over as a chapter in his notoriety and in the Ripper question that trails him. The 5 people he killed at Rainhill and the 6th he killed at Windsor survive in most of that literature as the occasion for his fame rather than as themselves. Marie James, who followed him across the world and back, and lies now she scarcely knows where. The 4 children, of whom the record cannot even reliably give all 4 names. Emily Lydia Mather, 26 years old, married under a false name, and carried 10,000 miles to be killed in a rented room. Of them all, it is Emily who has the fuller memorial, and it is worth ending on it, because her people would not let her become only an occasion, At the Melbourne General Cemetery, a monument was raised to her by public subscription, naming her as the beloved daughter of the Mathers of Rainhill, and setting down, in the plain verse of its inscription, that she had striven to live in honour, and had trusted the man who without cause or warning denied her her life. That she has a stone with her name on it, when so much of the rest of the case has kept only his, is the single mercy the record affords, and it is a small one. The case of Frederick Bailey Deeming was the single matter examined in this account. The conviction was entered, the execution was carried out in 1892, the case became part of the national record, it has not left. Ends.